last two keynotes of the day. So it's my great pleasure to introduce David Stilwell. David is going to be sharing some of his research on the use of social media data and the possible impacts of the digital footprints we all leave as we, comment, like and share online. David, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Is this going to magically appear? Do you have to do something? No, great. Hello, everyone. I'm from a business school. I've got this really long job title, lecturer in Big Data Analytics and Quantitative Social Science. What does it actually mean? Basically, I've got a background in social science, so I used to be a psychologist, but I use big data as my method to understand people. So I want to talk a little bit today about getting that big data and some of the issues around that, and hopefully suggest a potential alternative avenue that's come up that I haven't seen a lot of researchers using. I think it will be relatively controversial, so I will leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So I think it's a 45-minute slot, so I'll try to finish in 30 minutes so we have plenty of time to discuss, and if we're done, we can move on to the next speaker. Those who may recognize the Psychometrics Center, so one of the things that we worked on is understanding people's psychology from their social media data. Very quick show of hands, who's heard of a little company called Cambridge Analytica? Yeah, okay. They were nothing to do with me. On the other hand, I did publish some of the research that they then read about in a journal and thought, wouldn't this be a great idea to put that into practice? I have been sort of keeping up with, since the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal came in, especially when it blew up in about March 2018, some things have changed in the way that we can get data from companies such as Facebook, and I think generally have changed for the worse. As I say, I'll talk about what's changed and what might the alternative solution be. All right, so first, no, I'll use this. Okay. So what is it when we're talking about big data? So here's a bunch of examples. So people immediately think of, well, big data, it's all Facebook and Twitter, and they're part of it, but you've got things like what you search for on Google. So if I'm trying to think of the most sort of sensitive data about me, the things I've thought about and asked Google about are probably some of the most sensitive things I can imagine. My emails, Gmail, what's on our cell phones that we're all walking around with these data collection devices. But then you've also, Amazon.com, so, big retailer, what we buy. This is cookies, so those little things that sit on your browser and sort of follow you around the internet and starts to build up a profile of all the different websites you go to. But then some more traditional things, such as Tesco Clubcard, for example, which came into an effect somewhere in the mid-90s or so. And if you think about, who can best predict when I'm going to die? Right? So is it my doctor? Probably not. Probably it's my Tesco Clubcard, because it knows all the terrible food that I keep buying. Right? So, if I am a researcher who's interested in mortality or food and its relationship to various sort of medical factors, I think the Clubcard data would be incredibly valuable and incredibly interesting. Or another example is at the bottom, people's credit cards, right? So those credit card companies are collecting all that data. We did a little project with the credit card company, and I was quite surprised how much that they actually know about the things you're spending, in terms of, well, you might think I've just bought something at this retailer, and the credit card company will just have a number that sort of an ID for the retailer, but actually they go further and they categorize all those retailers so they know that you spent money in a hotel in this location, or you spent money in a supermarket in that location. So they know quite a lot from this kind of credit card data. So what do these things have in common? So you might be thinking, well, first of all, they're digital data. You might be thinking they're sort of part of the data exhaust that people generate as they go about their daily lives. But the other thing that all these data have in common is that they're all controlled by companies, right? So if you want to get access to that data, you need to talk to the person, the people who control it, and that's commercial organizations. And that's really changed. So, I'm clicking, this doesn't work, okay. And that's really changed because not so long ago, social scientists kind of had a monopoly on big data from places like the Census or the British Household Panel Survey, and sort of government initiatives that were collecting large data about people's behavior across the population. But of course, Facebook, Google, all the rest of them have far better data on people's behavior now than anything the government has control of. Especially me in a business school, if I'm trying to understand employees in a company, then I need to go to companies and to work with them to get their data. We'd love to use this data for research, right? So, and that's partly it's curiosity-driven research. The Tesco Clubcard stuff, we might be curious about, well, what foods are linked to what, disease prevalence in the future, for example. So there's sort of curiosity involved, but we're also interested in, well, what is the effect of these digital platforms on people's lives? So what is the way that somewhere like YouTube on the left here has changed people's lives? So this graph shows of those who use this particular platform, so the various platforms there, what percentage of them use it every day? So you see 45% of people who use YouTube use it every day. Okay, so, and going all the way up to Facebook, 74% of people who, have a Facebook account use it every day. So there's good reason to think that those platforms, those sort of ecosystems, could have quite a large impact on people's lives. So we're not just looking at the kind of curiosity-driven sort of more sort of deep questions. We're also looking at what are the impact of these platforms on people's lives. Just very quick, is anyone here work at Facebook? No one? Okay, so that's good because I've got quite a few examples about Facebook. So partly, it's just something that I've come to know about because of the kinds of things I do in my research. So I'm not saying that Facebook is the only platform that has an impact on people's lives, on society. Actually, the Google searches, Google decides what information people can learn about, essentially, right? So anything I want to learn about, probably Google has had some say in whether what I learn about when I'm interested in a topic. So, platforms have incredible power. It's not just Facebook. On the other hand, well, in my opinion, Facebook is probably the platform that does have the largest effect on society, which is partly why I talk about it. So what can you do? So you can go to companies and you can start a collaboration with the companies and with the company, and it's not easy. You go through a lot of legal hurdles, you go through a lot of PR hurdles. It takes quite a long time to do, but you can work with companies and get them to share their data for research. So for example, we did a project with a big UK bank, and they sent out a survey to some of their customers. The customers filled it in and consented, and so we got back not just the results from the survey, but data from what they'd, the bank transactions in their account. And to be honest, I thought, bank data is something that you could just never get access to, but it turns out it was possible. It takes a long time to do it, and we've got people consenting, so they know they're going to be sharing their data. They're not just giving us lots of bank data where no one's consented. So it's possible to do, and we looked at what are happy people buy. Turns out if you buy things that match your personality, then you're happier than if you buy things that mismatch. So you can imagine a future where companies recommend things that, instead of things that they know that you'll buy, they'll recommend things that they think might make you happy, which is an interesting way of looking at it. So it is possible to do that, and you can get quite deep data. But the downside of going to a company is that companies do have their own incentives. So the bank, it doesn't attack the bank's business model to look at purchases and their relationship to happiness. But certain companies would just sort of rather not know about certain things, right? So the impact of their business, if it's potentially negative, they don't really, they're not incentivized to share with the researcher some data that might look bad on what their organization does. Or even if they're sort of, maybe they're just, they'd quite like to know the answer, but they certainly don't want the public to know. So a lot of companies are doing things internally that we never hear about because they find out answers that actually, the PR people say that they shouldn't share. So there's limits to this data sharing. So you can't just expect to go to a company and expect them to be delighted to share their data so that you can do a piece of research which might undermine what they do. So we end up getting glimpses about things that might be going on from investigations from outside, especially from journalists, but we don't get kind of systematic studies, the kind of thing that researchers are really good at, sort of really looking at things in an independent way, because sort of journalists can pick out some things, but you don't get the overall picture. So here's a few examples. So, back 25th of October, so in 2018, so last year, there's a news article saying, some organization had spent £250,000 on pro-Brexit adverts, and they'd given themselves a name. It's called Mainstream Network, but whenever you look for Mainstream Network, you don't find anything. So there's sort of an inkling that there's something going on with political advertising, and there's anonymous advertisers. But we don't have a systematic study that says, well, how much of this is there really? How big of an effect might it be having? What's sort of really going on in a way that a researcher would find out, not just a journalist who's sort of finding an example. Another example here, and all these examples are just from the Facebook advertising system. So, potential effects of the Facebook advertising system. So as I said, the YouTube algorithm has its own set of effects. So I'm just talking about advertising. So, here's another example. So Martin Lewis, the sort of consumer champion, basically said to Facebook, lots of adverts keep appearing with my face on it, selling kind of cryptocurrencies and other things that it turned out were scams, and people were losing their money, and they're trusting these things because it has my face, but it's nothing to do with me. And then Facebook comes and says, well, if you tell us about the advert, then we'll take it down. So then Martin Lewis is left with, well, how can I possibly find all the adverts on Facebook that have my face on it? So how big of an effect might this be having? How many people are losing their money because of this? How widespread are these scammy adverts? We don't really know because we found some examples, but we haven't looked at it systematically. Similar thing, adverts for job advertising, and these journalists and non-profit organizations had to work really hard to find some adverts that were for jobs, that they were targeted at just men, so women never saw these adverts. So wouldn't it be nice to look at all the adverts on the system and for a researcher to find out what's going on? But again, it's not really possible because the organization is not incentivized to share this because it's only going to be bad news. So here's another recent one, which I find to be completely wild. So you may have seen that Facebook's latest policy is that politicians are allowed to lie in advertising, and their position is that sort of free speech and politicians should be allowed to lie. And they argue that if we as voters realize that someone's lying, then we can not vote for them, and therefore that would be great for everyone. And so it's kind of an empirical question, right? So how much would politicians lying in adverts, how much does the system mean that someone who lies has a backlash and doesn't get voted for versus someone who doesn't lie, or if they lie, does that actually mean they get more votes? And again, it would be nice to do a systematic study, but again, it's not really possible. So Elizabeth Warren actually made up lies about Zuckerberg and said that, put up adverts saying Zuckerberg has endorsed Trump for president, just to prove the point that, it's ridiculous that a politician is allowed to lie in an advert. UK election has just begun, and the same policy applies here. So how much effect might it have? We don't know. It would be nice to do a systematic study. And then this is a final example. So the Myanmar genocide, the UN found that to some extent it was sort of supported through people sort of talking to each other on Facebook and organizing on this platform. So to some extent, the existence of this platform has supported sort of terrible outcomes in this country. So wouldn't it be nice to research the impact of the platform? Wouldn't it be nice to have some social scientists sort of looking at what's going on? So Facebook have, in the middle of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Zuckerberg was pulled in front of Congress, and he announced this new initiative, Social Science One. And what they were going to do was they were going to release a lot of data to academics to look into political link sharing on Facebook, so that we might be able to do some more systematic research into, well, how much of this sharing is there, how might it affect votes, if you look at different parts of the country, can you look for differences, and what is the impact of this platform. It was not a new idea, so I actually met, I was invited to Facebook in 2011, along with some other academic researchers, and the idea was floated that why doesn't Facebook ask its users whether they want to opt in to share data for research purposes. So it was considered then, but in the sort of crucible of Mark Zuckerberg being in front of Congress, it sort of pushed it forward, and Social Science One was born. The goal was at the end of the year, so at the end of 2018, this data would be released to researchers. What's happened, we're now November 2019. Facebook has not released the data that it said it was going to release. It's not only sort of behind schedule, but they say they're going to release much less data than they promised at the time. September, you may have seen reports that the funders, so the non-profit groups who are funding this initiative, are threatening to pull out. Data's not there. Facebook saying, well, we're working on differential privacy because we have to make sure that we're looking after people's data, and the privacy is incredibly important. And therefore, because of this, when the data does come, it will be much less than you expect. So my other question with this is that even if they did release this data, it's only for tackling the question of sort of link sharing and what it might affect. So what if researchers want to look at something else, right? So does social media make people more anxious? That's not something that currently Social Science One is set up to do, and they say, well, we're going to start here and then we'll move to other areas. But it's sort of taken a while, and we're not there yet, and the next election has come, and we still don't know about the influence of social media in elections. I'm sort of frustrated that we're not at a stage where we can answer some of these really fundamental questions that would be quite nice to answer, given that another election is coming up. So what's the alternative? The alternative might be APIs, so application programming interfaces. So that's where I got my data when I did research on people's Facebook likes. So I created an app back in 2007 now. It put a personality test on Facebook. People could go along to the app, take a personality test about themselves. If they wanted, they could additionally opt in to sharing their Facebook data. So in that case, we knew what are they doing on Facebook and how did they answer our personality test. And then we looked into, well, can you predict someone's personality from their Facebook likes? At the time, Facebook likes were public. There were no privacy settings to make your Facebook likes private. So at the time, if you liked something like, camping or Britney Spears or whatever it was sort of seen as, well, this is something that you're doing in public. It's not particularly sensitive data. So companies could go along to the Britney Spears page and download a list of everyone who liked Britney Spears. So, part of why we published this was to show that people's, this information that doesn't seem very private, like someone's Facebook likes, can predict very private things. So it turns out if you like camping, for example, you're 60% likely to vote Republican. So, it's sort of a little piece of information, slightly more likely, but if you take hundreds of someone's Facebook likes, then you start getting a consistent picture about what is this person like. Facebook were also working themselves on the same kind of research. So Facebook, sort of internally, their research team were working on, can you predict people's personality from their status updates? They never, that I've seen, published a paper on it, but they have got a patent on it. So they're talking about how you can, the inferred personality characteristics are stored in connection with the user's profile and may be used for targeting, ranking, selecting versions of products and various other purposes. So this kind of technology was sort of being created within Facebook at the time that we were publishing and showing that it's possible. We published this stuff. It did lead to a lot of coverage, and to some extent, Facebook did change their policies later. So if you like something, there was now by default privacy settings for those. But since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, these guys call it an API collapse. Social media companies, not just Facebook, but Twitter and some others as well, have been cutting back on the data that is allowed to be shared with academics. So this is basically what it was like in 2011, 2012 when we were doing our research, which is that users had their Facebook data. They could share it with researchers through an API. So it's a bit like on your phone when you download an app and it says, do you want to allow this app to access your, your text messages? So the same thing pops up on social media. Do you want this app to access your Facebook likes? And the company kind of facilitated this access, this conversation between researchers and users. But I think now it's more like users are only allowed to share certain data because companies are reversing on what data they make available. And the company also sets rules when you sign up to an API saying what you're allowed to use the data for. They don't have particular rules about what scientists are allowed to do versus what commercial organizations are allowed to do. You have to read those terms incredibly carefully if you're thinking about getting Facebook data or Twitter data, whatever it is, through the official company API, because there are a lot of restrictions on what you're allowed to do. All right, so that's sort of the bad news about APIs. Quick show of hands, who knows what the GDPR is? Okay, and who would be able to, if I picked one of you with your hands up, who would be able to say what GDPR stands for? Okay, not bad, but fewer hands. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, this is the EU's sort of rules about what companies, what organizations should do with personal data and what rights you have as an individual to that data. So it came into effect May 2018. includes 8 broad rights. This is one of them that I think is quite interesting, that most people haven't heard of. So this is the right to data portability. So any company that has your data, you have the right under data portability to ask for a copy of that data, and it has to be provided in an electronic format, a sort of a normal format like CSV or XML that other organizations can use, so intentionally so that you could take your data and take it somewhere else, right? So take it to a competitor. So if you wanted to stop using LinkedIn, you get all your LinkedIn data and you take it to some competitor and you wouldn't have to recreate everything from scratch. So EU is trying to cut down on the monopolies that companies have over our data. So as I said, structured, commonly used, a machine-readable form like CSV, structured so software can extract elements of the data. Information has to be provided free of charge, so they're not allowed to charge you to get access to your data. It might even be required to transmit the data directly to another company rather than to the individual. So we have this right to get our data, which also means our participants have a right to get their data, right? So you could ask your participants to say, here's the instructions, go to, here's how to do it, go to this page, get your data, and then share it with us. Right? And because they're doing it via GDPR, via this right to data portability, the company can't put rules about what you're allowed to do with the data, because it's an individual getting their own data and doing whatever they like with it. Okay? So the relationship is sort of direct between scientist and participant, rather than with this company as an intermediate. Here's the video that we created on our website that shows participants how to get their Facebook data. We created this thing rather than sort of step-by-step instructions to show, well, here's how you do it. So you go to here, you click which data you want to get. So posts and likes and various other things. You decide the format, so JSON is easy to do. You press the Create File button. Depending on what data it is, it happens quite quickly that this file is generated. You then go to the available files and you download your data, and it's now on your computer and you've got a copy of your data, and you could then upload it to a researcher's website. And we've found that people were willing to do this. Given the nice video that says what to do, people were willing to go through the process to get their data. Now, not all companies comply with the legislation. So Facebook and Twitter make it very easily, and they make the data available quickly. LinkedIn, when I did it a few months ago, I pressed the download my data button, and it took them a couple of days before they actually gave me access to my data. Even though when I downloaded it, it was about 2 megabytes of data, but apparently it took them 2 days to generate this data. You can explain that. Amazon took 30 days, which happens to be the number that GDPR says they're required to get the data within 30 days. But also it took many steps. So, despite one click to order anything from Amazon to my house and it arrives within 24 hours, if I want to get my data, I have to go on the web page and it's quite hidden. I do something, I have to log in. Then they send me an email. I have to respond to the email. Then they back to the email again, and then I do something or other. And eventually they generate this file, and then I had to do some other things once I got the file. But then I could download my data. And it happened to take this 30 days. Reddit doesn't seem to comply at all, and I saw some discussion on Reddit where they basically said, we're not going to do this for now. So not all companies necessarily make it easy to share this data, but maybe one of the things we might do as researchers is sort of remind companies that this is what they're required to do. Okay, so final 2 slides. Alternatives. There is legislative approaches, so especially the EU are looking into should they require companies to share data with researchers. So there's some downsides with this. So number one is sort of the time that's likely to take before it gets to a point where legislation is put into effect. The other side is because a company is sharing the data and participants aren't necessarily sort of involved in that, you can imagine there's sort of limitations in terms of what have people consented for, and therefore what questions can you sort of legitimately feel like you have the sort of the good authority to answer. So these curiosity-driven questions might be a bit harder to justify when you're getting data from people who haven't explicitly consented. So it might be only for sort of more clear sort of social welfare benefit questions that would be good, despite the downside. Okay, so summarize. Companies have lots of data relevant to social science. They're not always incentivized to share it. I think data portability gives another interesting alternative to researchers. That doesn't mean that other initiatives aren't valuable, such as Social Science One. So, keep working on those, but in the meantime, this is an alternative. And then final two things, reminding you have this right to data portability. You also have rights around automated decision-making that you might not be aware. So if a company makes a decision about you based on your data, so if you're applying for a loan and they decide not to give you a loan, they are also, if you ask, they're required to give you an explanation of how they made that decision. They're also required to, if you sort of say you disagree, they're required to get a human involved to review the decision and see whether the company's sticking with it or not. So that's another interesting one, getting companies to talk about what they're doing with our data. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. How are we doing for time? Are we past?
No, we're doing great for time. So thanks so much, David. I'm sure we've got questions. So are there any questions? Who's brave enough to give the first one? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. My question is, so let's say companies are required to make data available for their researchers, and then you have something like with the ads where you have anonymous researchers coming up, or anonymous institutions, or institutions you can't link to a real university. How would that work?
So when you say companies are required to make data available to researchers, so the data portability right means companies are required to make data available to the individual, who can then share it with anyone they want to. So if the individual decides to share it with another company, then that's up to the individual, it's their data. This isn't, it's sort of, it's put on the individual, it's sort of your data, you decide who you want to share it with. If you think a company might use the data beneficially for you, then you might want to share with them, and then you get the benefits of that. In terms of the EU stuff about companies being required to share for research purposes, I'm sure there'd have to be rules about, how do you define what a researcher is, and also sort of the central agency, whoever's organizing this thing, sort of deciding what questions are allowed to be answered or not. So that would be a very kind of process-driven approach, as opposed to the data portability, which is kind of a free market approach. It's allowing users to do what they like with their data.
Sorry, how are, I mean, we aren't able to say what's a fake news. How are we going to be able to say who's a fake researcher or what's a fake research project?
Yeah, I see your point, but on the other hand, I also think, it's quite sort of paternalistic to say to people, well, it's your data, but you can't use it for what you want to use it for. I can imagine situations where people share it with organizations that they regret. But I mean, we're still in the situation now where people are filling in information with organizations that they also regret. I do think it's a good thing that people can do what they like with their data.
There's one in the middle, just back there.
Hi. So don't you think we've got a compound issue? So you've got a problem with ad agencies and you've got no idea who the back end of that person is selling stuff, the ad on the web. And you've also got problems with computational propaganda. So you've got bots and fake accounts propagating things. And the two kind of go together. So how would we kind of unpick that to get that spread of that fake news and that misinformation? Potentially, maybe.
I mean, you know, these are tough questions. On the other hand, you know, if anyone can do it, scientists can. So I guess I'm optimistic about that. Yeah. But you know, but someone needs to be starting to look into it, and you know, for me, I think scientists are the people to do it, in collaboration with journalists and all the rest of it.
I had a big argument with The Guardian, actually. I had a bit of an argument with The Guardian a couple of years ago, because I worked in our information security office and we had problems with malvertising. So legitimate websites with dodgy ads, and we were running ad blockers, and of course The Guardian wouldn't serve their content onto pages with an ad blocker, and I'm like, but we're running it because there's a problem and you can't stop that because of this. So kind of you've got also a problem there with revenue streams for journalists and advertising too.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly a very complicated system, right? And lots of things kind of mixing together. But I guess, like, we need to have some data to start with, start unpicking.
I think we've got time probably for one more question.
Hi, this is not really a question, more of a comment. When you speak about the GDPR regulations, and there was a comment about Edward Snowden on the fact that the GDPR has misplaced the problem into privacy, whereas it should be about collection, because companies are just collecting our data all the time, and there's not really a way that we can stop that. And if we have Siri, Siri listens all the time, and if we have Google, Google listens all the time, and then we get all the ads that are towards our own preferences. So, I mean, maybe a comment, or what do you think that's going to make that collection also a bit more regulated?
Yeah, well, so one thing I like about GDPR actually is that previously, you know, data protection in the UK, it was very much about who's getting our data and making sure that there was consent, and it was sort of all about, you know, mostly about the that first who's collecting it. I think what people are much more concerned about is actually not who's collecting my data, but what are they doing with it. I do, for example, this little thing with my students where I say, well, if someone took your Facebook data and predicted your personality and used that to give you, you know, to personalize your medical care, would you think that's a good thing? And lots of them say yes. And then I say, well, what if same technology, but it was used to decide whether you get a mortgage or not? And then they were saying no. So same data still being collected by a company, same algorithms, but depending on what it's used for makes a big difference. So I quite like what GDPR, you know, part of it is what it does is it helps you understand, well, what a company is doing with my data, right? How are they making these decisions? So it's about the kind of the later process of what's being done with my data. So Cambridge Analytica, for example, I think what people really hated was the particular use of it, right? Like it's being used to support a right-wing politician, perhaps even more than what the data actually was. And if it was being used for another purpose, people would have been okay. You know, certainly we do need to know who's collecting our data, but then we need to know what they're doing it for, what they're using it for.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks
Thanks.
so much, David.